The morning of August 2nd, 1945, a repair depot outside Tokyo, Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto stood before the burnt-out hulk of an American M4 Sherman tank, captured intact 3 months earlier during fighting on Okinawa. The tank had been transported to Japan at great expense. Naval ordnance officers wanted answers. They needed to understand why American tank crews kept surviving hits that should have killed them. Yamamoto had examined dozens of destroyed Japanese tanks. He knew the mathematics of death inside armor. When a Type 97 Chiha took a direct hit, crews rarely escaped. The statistics were brutal. 90% casualty rates among tank crews whose vehicles were knocked out, men burned alive, men crushed trying to squeeze through inadequate hatches while flames consumed the interior, men who never had a chance. But American crews kept walking away. Intelligence reports from Saipan, from the Philippines, from Iwo Jima, all told the same impossible story. Sherman tanks would be hit, sometimes multiple times, and then crew members would emerge, alive, moving, fighting. The engineers needed to know how. Yamamoto climbed onto the Sherman's hull. The tank had taken a 47mm hit to its side armor. The round had penetrated. The interior showed fire damage. But the tank sat complete, intact, ready to reveal its secrets. He opened the commander's cupola. The hatch swung easily on its hinges. Large, spacious, a man could exit quickly through this opening. He moved to the loader's position. Another hatch, also large. Both turret crew members had individual escape routes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Yamamoto dropped into the turret. The interior smelled of burnt paint and scorched metal. He moved through the crew compartment methodically, photographing, measuring, counting. The driver's position had its own overhead hatch. The assistant driver, the bow gunner, also had a dedicated hatch. 4 separate escape routes from the top of the tank. 4 chances for crew members to get out when their vehicle was hit. Then Yamamoto found the 5th exit. On the hull floor, between the driver and assistant driver positions, a hinged panel. He unlatched it. The escape hatch dropped open. 1/2 inch thick steel, large enough for a man to fit through. Positioned so crew members could drop straight down and roll clear under the tank's protection. 5 escape hatches, 5 ways out, 5 chances to survive. Yamamoto thought about the Type 97 medium tank, the tank that formed the backbone of Imperial Japanese armor, the tank his brother had died in at Saipan. He thought about the escape routes Japanese tankers had available when their vehicle was hit. The commander's cupola, if it wasn't jammed from impact damage, the hull machine gunner's small front hatch, if you could reach it. Through flames, maybe the driver's vision port, if you were small enough and desperate enough, that was all. No floor escape hatch, no individual hatches for each crew member, no quick exits carefully positioned for maximum survival, just narrow openings that became death traps when a tank was burning. The disparity was crushing. American tank designers had spent years optimizing crew survivability. Japanese designers had focused on other priorities: armor thickness, gun performance, mechanical reliability, weight reduction. Crew escape had been an afterthought. The cost of that choice was written in blood across every Pacific battlefield. The Sherman tank entered American service in February 1942. The M4 medium tank represented the culmination of nearly 2 decades of American armored vehicle development. Engineers at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland had studied every aspect of tank design: armor protection, firepower, mobility, mechanical reliability, and crew survivability. American designers understood something fundamental about modern warfare. Tanks were machines. Machines could be replaced. Trained tank crews could not. The United States entered World War II with a professional military that numbered less than 200,000 men. American war planners knew they would need to rapidly expand the armed forces to millions of soldiers. Training those soldiers took time. Training tank crews took even more time. A competent Sherman crew required months of specialized instruction, driver training, gunnery training, radio operation, maintenance procedures, tactical coordination, small unit tactics. Each crew member needed dozens of skills. Each skill required practice and repetition. Losing a trained crew meant losing hundreds of hours of training investment. It meant taking 4 or 5 men out of combat operations. It meant finding and training replacements who would be less experienced and less effective. American tank designers approached crew survivability as an engineering problem with measurable solutions. The Aberdeen Proving Ground conducted extensive tests on crew evacuation procedures. Engineers timed how quickly men could exit through different hatch configurations. They measured hatch sizes. They tested hatch positions. They analyzed what happened when tanks were hit and how crew members reacted. The data drove design decisions. Early American tank designs, like the M3 Lee medium tank, had limited escape routes. The M3 featured a tall profile with the main 75mm gun mounted in a hull sponson. Crew positions were cramped. Hatches were small. Evacuation took too long. Tank crews complained. After-action reports documented the problems. Men died because they couldn't get out fast enough. The M4 Sherman addressed those deficiencies systematically. The turret was redesigned to accommodate 2 large hatches. The commander's cupola provided 360 degrees of visibility and a wide exit. The loader received a dedicated hatch on the turret roof. Both hatches were spring-loaded to open quickly. Both were positioned to allow rapid evacuation, even if the turret was traversed at an odd angle. The hull crew received similar attention. The driver and assistant driver each got overhead hatches that were significantly larger than those on earlier American tanks. The hatches were positioned to minimize interference with vision blocks and equipment. But the most innovative feature was the hull escape hatch. Positioned on the floor of the hull between the transmission and the turret basket, the escape hatch provided a way out when top exits were blocked or inaccessible. The hatch was large enough for a man wearing combat equipment to drop through. It was accessible from anywhere in the front hull. The logic was straightforward. If a Sherman was hit from above, crew members could use top hatches. If a Sherman was hit from the side, crew members could drop through the floor hatch and exit under the vehicle's protective shadow. If a Sherman was overturned, the floor hatch might still be accessible when top hatches were blocked. Multiple escape routes meant multiple chances to survive. American engineers also considered the human factors of emergency evacuation: panic, confusion, injury, fire. Men trying to evacuate a burning tank were not thinking clearly. They were scared, they were hurt, they needed exits that were intuitive and easy to use. Sherman hatches opened outward. They didn't require complex latching mechanisms. A simple handle, a push. The spring-loaded hinge did the rest. Even an injured crew member could operate the hatches. The positioning was equally important. Each crew member knew which hatch was closest to his position. The driver used his overhead hatch. The assistant driver used his overhead hatch. The gunner typically exited through the commander's cupola since it was larger. The loader used the loader's hatch. Everyone knew the floor escape hatch was available if needed. Training drills reinforced these procedures. Sherman crews practiced emergency evacuation until it became automatic. Tanks would be hit during exercises. Crews would bail out. Instructors would time them 15 seconds from hit to all crew members clear of the vehicle. That was the standard. Japanese tank crews practiced no such drills. The concept of rapid evacuation was foreign to Imperial Japanese Army doctrine. Japanese military culture emphasized fighting to the death. Surrender was disgrace. Abandoning your vehicle was surrender. This philosophy permeated every aspect of Japanese armored warfare. The Type 97 Chiha medium tank entered service in 1938. Design work had begun in 1935. The tank was intended to replace the aging Type 89 medium tank, which had proven too slow to keep pace with mechanized infantry operations. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries led the design effort. Engineers focused on creating a tank that could move quickly across varied terrain, support infantry operations, engage enemy fortifications. The specifications emphasized mobility and firepower. The Type 97 used a bell crank suspension system derived from the earlier Type 95 Hago light tank, 6 road wheels per side, coil springs. The suspension performed well on roads and moderately rough terrain. Top speed reached approximately 40 kilometers per hour, reasonable for a 15-ton medium tank. The main armament was a 57mm Type 97 tank gun. Low velocity, short barrel, designed primarily for infantry support using high explosive shells. The gun could fire armor-piercing rounds, but penetration was limited. Against fortifications and infantry positions, the gun was adequate. Against enemy tanks, it was increasingly inadequate. The hull was riveted construction. Armor thickness ranged from 8mm on the hull floor to 25mm on the front plate. The armor was designed to stop small arms fire and shell fragments. It would not stop anti-tank weapons. It would not stop dedicated armor-piercing rounds from enemy tanks. 4 crew members operated the Type 97. The driver sat on the right side of the front hull. The hull machine gunner sat on the left. Both men were separated from the fighting compartment by the transmission and other mechanical components. Communication between hull crew and turret crew required a system of push buttons connected to lights and buzzers. The turret crew consisted of 2 men, the commander and the gunner. Both men worked in a cramped 2-man turret that barely provided room for the gun breech and ammunition storage. The commander operated the turret rotation mechanism manually. He also served as loader for the main gun. He also maintained observation and issued orders. 1 man, multiple jobs. The tank's armor was thin by design. Japanese military doctrine in the 1930s assumed tank versus tank combat would be rare. The Type 97 was optimized for infantry support operations against Chinese forces that largely lacked modern anti-tank weapons. In that context, the design made sense. Crew escape was never a priority consideration. The driver accessed his position through a small front opening hatch with horizontal vision slots. The hatch was barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. It was positioned low on the glacier's plate. In an emergency, the driver would need to open the hatch, which swung forward, then pull himself up and out through the narrow opening. If the tank was moving, if flames were spreading, if the driver was injured, this exit was almost impossible to use. The hull machine gunner had a similar hatch on his side, equally small, equally difficult. The turret crew had it slightly better. The commander's cupola featured a round hatch that provided the best exit from the vehicle, but the commander also had the most responsibilities during combat. He was directing the tank, observing the battlefield, coordinating with other tanks. If the commander was killed or injured, the gunner had to climb over the commander's position to reach the cupola hatch. There was no hull floor escape hatch. The concept apparently never occurred to Japanese designers, or if it did occur, it was rejected as an unnecessary weakness in the hull armor, or perhaps it was rejected as unnecessary because Japanese military doctrine did not emphasize crew preservation. Whatever the reason, the Type 97 provided its crew with exactly 2 practical escape routes: the commander's cupola and the hull machine gunner's hatch, if you could reach it. That was all. The disparity between American and Japanese approach to crew survivability reflected fundamentally different philosophies about warfare and the value of human life. American military doctrine treated soldiers as valuable assets, trained them well, equip them well, preserve them when possible. The United States had the industrial capacity to build thousands of tanks. Trained crews were the limiting factor. Keeping experienced crews alive made tactical and strategic sense. Japanese military doctrine treated soldiers as expendable resources. Bushido culture emphasized self-sacrifice. Death in combat was honorable. Survival could be disgraceful. The individual soldier existed to serve the emperor and the nation. Personal preservation was secondary to mission accomplishment. These philosophical differences manifested in every detail of tank design. Sherman tanks included multiple redundant safety features. Wet ammunition storage in later models, where ammunition was stored in racks surrounded by water and glycol to reduce fire risk. Armored ammunition bins. Fire extinguishers positioned throughout the crew compartment. Emergency engine shutoffs accessible from multiple positions. The design philosophy assumed that tanks would be hit. The goal was to keep the crew alive when it happened. Japanese tanks included none of these features. Ammunition was stored wherever space allowed, no fire suppression systems beyond what crew members could improvise, no redundant safety measures. The design philosophy assumed that if your tank was hit hard enough to matter, you were probably going to die anyway. Might as well save the weight and complexity. This fatalistic approach extended to tactical doctrine. When Type 97 tanks engaged American forces, Japanese commanders often ordered attacks that were essentially suicide charges, mass tank assaults across open ground, against prepared defensive positions, frontal attacks against superior firepower, last-ditch banzai charges when defeat was inevitable. American commanders, by contrast, used armor more conservatively, combined arms tactics, tank infantry cooperation, artillery support, air support, overwhelming firepower applied methodically, minimize casualties, accomplish objectives with maximum efficiency. The Battle of Saipan in June 1944 illustrated these contrasting philosophies with devastating clarity. Saipan was the largest island in the Mariana Archipelago, 15 miles long, 6 miles wide, volcanic mountains, dense jungle, coral formations, sugarcane fields, and 30,000 Japanese defenders who knew defeat meant the American B-29 bombers would be within striking range of Tokyo. The American invasion began on June the 15th, 1944, 2 Marine divisions and 1 Army division. Over 70,000 men, naval gunfire pounded the island for 2 days before the landing. Aircraft from 15 carriers hammered defensive positions, the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific War to date. The invasion fleet included over 100 M4 Sherman tanks. Most were M4A2 models, diesel-powered variants that the Marine Corps preferred. The Sherman outclassed anything the Japanese had on Saipan. Better armor, better gun, better reliability, better crew survivability. The Japanese 9th Tank Regiment defended Saipan with 44 tanks, 31 Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, 13 Type 95 Heigo light tanks. Colonel Yoshitsugu Goto commanded the regiment. He had trained his crews for years. They were competent, experienced tankers. They knew their vehicles intimately. Goto watched American forces establish their beachhead through the afternoon of June 15th. His orders were clear: counterattack, drive the Americans back into the sea. Do it before they consolidated their position. Do it before their superior numbers and firepower became overwhelming. Goto planned a night attack, maximum surprise, mass assault. His 44 tanks would spearhead the assault. Infantry would follow, break through the Marine lines, reach the beach, destroy the supply dumps, force the Americans to evacuate or die. The attack began at 0400 hours on June 17th. Engines roaring through the humid tropical darkness, 44 tanks advancing in formation, supporting infantry following close behind, Japanese artillery laying down preparatory fire. American sentries spotted the tanks almost immediately. The sound of diesel engines carried through the night air. The ground vibrated. Marines at forward positions passed the alarm. Tank attack, multiple vehicles, coming fast. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Puller commanded 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. His positions were directly in the path of Goto's assault. Puller had been expecting this. Japanese doctrine favored night attacks, counterattacks against newly established beachheads. He had positioned his Marines accordingly. The Marines had M4 Sherman tanks from 2nd Tank Battalion. They had M3 75mm self-propelled guns on half-tracks. They had M1A1 bazookas. They had 37mm anti-tank guns. Most importantly, they had radio communications that allowed rapid coordination of all these assets. The first Japanese tanks crested a ridge at 0415, their Type 97 Chiha silhouettes clearly visible against the pre-dawn sky. Staff Sergeant Ernest Diller spotted them through his Sherman's periscope and immediately alerted his gunner. Within seconds, the Marine positions erupted with defensive fire. Bazookas launched rockets. 37mm anti-tank guns opened up. Sherman tanks engaged targets at 600 meters range. Self-propelled guns fired high explosive rounds into the advancing Japanese formation. The Japanese tanks kept coming. They had momentum. They had courage. What they did not have was adequate armor or firepower. Private First Class Mitsuo Kubo, loaded his Type 97's 47mm gun as fast as his training allowed, the tank commander shouted target corrections over the engine noise. The gunner fired. The 47mm armor-piercing round struck a Sherman's frontal slope at steep angle. Sparks flew. The round deflected harmlessly into the darkness. Kubo watched through his vision block as the Sherman's turret traversed toward his tank. The American 75mm gun fired. The high-explosive shell struck Kubo's Chiha amidships. The explosion penetrated the thin armor. Fragments tore through the crew compartment. The tank commander slumped forward, blood streaming from wounds. The driver screamed. Kubo continued loading. Training overrode terror. Another 47mm round. Fire. Another deflection off Sherman armor. Another American return shot. This time, the 75mm armor-piercing round penetrated the Chiha's engine compartment. The diesel engine erupted in flames. Fire spread quickly through the Type 97's interior. Fuel lines ruptured. Oil ignited. Smoke filled the crew compartment. Kubo knew he had seconds to get out. The commander was dead or dying. The gunner was trying to reach the cupola hatch. Kubo looked for his own escape route. The hull machine gunner's hatch was on the wrong side of the tank. Flames blocked access. The commander's cupola was his only option. But the gunner was already there, struggling to open the hatch while flames licked at his legs. Kubo had to wait. Wait while the tank burned around him. Wait while the heat became unbearable. Wait while smoke filled his lungs. Wait for the gunner to get clear so he could reach the hatch himself. The gunner finally pulled himself through the cupola. Kubo climbed over the commander's body, reached the hatch, pulled himself up, emerged into the pre-dawn darkness with his uniform smoking and his hands burned. He rolled off the tank, hit the ground, crawled away from the burning hull. Around him, the battlefield was chaos. Japanese tanks burning, Marines advancing, artillery falling, tracer fire cutting through the darkness. Goto's counterattack was collapsing. The Type 95 Hago light tanks suffered even worse casualties than the medium tanks. Their 12mm maximum armor provided virtually no protection against any American weapon. Their 37mm guns could not penetrate Sherman armor from any angle. Marine infantry teams with bazookas stalked the light tanks through the coral formations. Each isolated Hago faced attacks from multiple directions, Sherman guns engaging from long range. Infantry teams closing for side shots with rocket launchers. One Hago took a 75mm high-explosive round directly through its thin side armor. The shell detonated inside the crew compartment. All 3 crew members died instantly. The tank continued rolling forward for several seconds, a ghost vehicle with dead men at the controls, until it struck a coral outcropping and stopped. Another Hago, commanded by Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, attempted to close with a Sherman to point-blank range, where his 37mm gun might penetrate side armor. Tanaka ordered his driver to maneuver through a grove of palm trees, use cover, get close before engaging. They got within 300 meters. Tanaka ordered his gunner to fire. The 37mm armor-piercing round struck the Sherman's turret face and bounced skyward. The American tank's turret traversed slowly toward the Japanese position. Tanaka watched with growing horror as the Sherman's 75mm gun elevated to engage. The Sherman fired. The shell completely destroyed Tanaka's Hago. The light tank's thin armor might as well have been paper. By 0500 hours, 31 of Goto's original 44 tanks had been destroyed or abandoned. The survivors scattered across the battlefield, most damaged and unable to continue fighting effectively. The largest tank assault in Pacific War history had become a catastrophic failure, but the human cost was even more devastating than the material loss. American tank crews who survived their Sherman being knocked out had trained procedures to fall back on: bail out through the nearest hatch, drop through the floor escape hatch if necessary, rally at a predetermined location, account for all crew members, receive medical treatment if injured, return to the fight in another tank, if possible. Japanese tank crews who survived their vehicle being knocked out had no such procedures, no training in evacuation, no rally points, no system for recovering wounded crew members. Most men who got out of burning tanks died within minutes from Marine rifle fire, artillery, or small arms. Those who survived, scattered into the jungle, became isolated infantry, died later in the campaign. Kubo survived June 17th. He spent the next 3 weeks hiding in caves, scavenging for food, avoiding American patrols. He watched Saipan fall, watched the final Banzai charge on July 7th that killed thousands of Japanese soldiers in a futile last stand. He was one of fewer than 1,000 Japanese military personnel who surrendered when the battle ended. American occupation forces collected him on July 10th, sent him to a prisoner of war camp, eventually transferred him to Okinawa for interrogation. That is where Lieutenant Yamamoto interviewed him in April 1945. Yamamoto was not interested in tactical intelligence about Japanese defensive positions. Other officers handled that. Yamamoto wanted to understand tank casualties, crew survival rates, what happened inside Japanese tanks when they were hit, how many men escaped, how many died. Kubo told him everything. The fire, the smoke, the desperate scramble to reach the single usable hatch, watching the gunners struggle to get clear while flames consumed the interior. The burns on his hands from touching hot metal. The screams of the driver trapped below. Yamamoto took notes, added Kubo's testimony to dozens of similar accounts from other survivors. The pattern was clear. Japanese tank crews had almost no chance of surviving if their vehicle was hit and caught fire. 60 seconds from penetrating hit to interior fully engulfed in flames, maybe 90 seconds in a best-case scenario, not enough time to evacuate through inadequate hatches. American tank crews, by comparison, were surviving at rates that seemed impossible. Intelligence reports from Saipan indicated that of approximately 25 Sherman tanks knocked out during the battle, crew casualties averaged 1 killed and 1 wounded per vehicle. Sometimes all 5 crew members survived. The Sherman's multiple escape hatches made the difference. Reports from Iwo Jima in February and March 1945 told similar stories. Japanese anti-tank guns would hit Shermans, penetrate armor, start fires, and American crews would evacuate. Most of them would live. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Yamamoto compiled his findings into a formal report in May 1945. The report was classified, distributed only to senior officers in the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. The conclusions were straightforward and damning. Japanese tank design had failed to adequately prioritize crew survivability. American tank design had made crew survivability a central consideration. This disparity translated directly into combat effectiveness. American tank units could sustain losses and continue fighting because trained crews survived to crew replacement vehicles. Japanese tank units that suffered heavy losses in equipment also lost their experienced crews. Replacing the crews took months. Months Japan did not have. The report recommended immediate design changes for future Japanese tank production. Multiple escape hatches, larger hatches positioned for rapid evacuation, hull floor escape hatches similar to Sherman design, fire suppression systems, improved ammunition storage to reduce fire risk. The recommendations arrived too late to matter. By May 1945, Japan's industrial capacity was collapsing. American B-29 bombers were destroying Japanese cities. Raw materials were unavailable. Factories were damaged or destroyed. The few tanks still in production were being held in reserve for the defense of the home islands. There would be no next-generation Japanese tank incorporating lessons learned from examining the Sherman. There would only be last-ditch defenses using whatever equipment remained, and crews who would die in their vehicles because their designers had never prioritized their survival. The Type 3 Chinu medium tank represented Japan's best effort to match the Sherman's firepower. Armed with a 75mm gun, the Chinu could theoretically fight American tanks on more equal terms. 144 were built between 1944 and 1945. But the Chinu still had the same fundamental survivability problems as earlier Japanese designs. Limited escape hatches, no hull floor escape, cramped interior, inadequate fire suppression. The gun was better, the armor was thicker, but crew survival was still an afterthought. American forces never encountered Chinu tanks in combat. All surviving vehicles were held in reserve on the Japanese home islands, awaiting the invasion that never came. After Japan surrendered in August 1945, American occupation forces examined the Chinu tanks thoroughly. The technical assessment noted the improved firepower, the better armor protection, and the continued neglect of crew survivability features. Even in their final tank design of the war, Japanese engineers had not fully grasped what American designers understood from the beginning. Tanks are machines. Machines can be replaced. Trained crews cannot. The Sherman tank's success in the Pacific War was not primarily about superior armor or firepower. Japanese anti-tank weapons could penetrate Sherman armor. Japanese tanks could sometimes achieve killing shots under the right circumstances. The Sherman was not invulnerable. The Sherman's success was about keeping crews alive, about recognizing that experienced tank crews were force multipliers, about designing vehicles where survival was possible even when things went wrong. This philosophy extended beyond just escape hatches, though the hatches were the most visible manifestation. Sherman tanks featured electrical systems designed to fail safe, circuit breakers to prevent fires, multiple fire extinguishers positioned throughout the crew compartment, ammunition stored in water-jacketed racks in later models, wet stowage that dramatically reduced fire risk. The interior layout was designed for rapid evacuation. Crew members could move through the compartment without climbing over major obstacles. The turret basket had openings that allowed hull crew to access the floor escape hatch. Everything was positioned to maximize survival chances. Japanese tanks featured none of these considerations. Electrical systems had minimal fire protection. Ammunition was stored wherever space allowed. The interior layout prioritized mechanical compactness over crew movement. Getting from one position to another inside a Type 97 required climbing over the transmission, around the gun breech, through narrow passages between equipment. In an emergency, with smoke filling the compartment and flames spreading, these design choices became death sentences. The statistics told the story in cold numbers. American tank crew casualties in the Pacific Theater averaged approximately 25% when their vehicle was knocked out. 1 in 4 crew members killed or seriously wounded. 3 in 4 survived. Japanese tank crew casualties when their vehicle was knocked out averaged over 90%. 9 in 10 dead, 1 in 10 surviving with serious injuries. The disparity was not about courage. Japanese tank crews fought with extraordinary bravery. They pressed attacks against overwhelming odds. They held positions until death. They executed suicidal charges, knowing they would die. Courage was never the issue. The disparity was about engineering, about design philosophy, about whether you valued your crews enough to spend the extra weight and complexity to give them a chance to survive. American designers answered yes. Japanese designers, bound by different cultural expectations and military doctrine, answered no. The human cost of that choice was staggering. Thousands of Japanese tank crew members died in vehicles that offered them no realistic chance of escape. Men like Kubo's tank commander, men like the Hago crews who died instantly when American shells penetrated their thin armor, men who never had a chance because their designers never gave them one. When Lieutenant Yamamoto stood before that captured Sherman in August 1945, counting escape hatches and measuring hatch dimensions, he was documenting a failure that went far beyond mechanical engineering. He was documenting a philosophical failure, a failure to recognize that soldiers' lives had value, a failure to prioritize survival over other considerations, a failure that had cost Japan thousands of trained tank crews it could never replace. The 5 escape hatches in the Sherman tank represented 5 chances to survive, 5 opportunities to get out of a burning vehicle, 5 ways American designers said, "We want you to live through this." The limited escape options in Japanese tanks represented a different message, a message that survival was not the priority, that sacrifice was expected, that your life mattered less than your mission. Both messages were accurate reflections of their respective military cultures. Both had consequences that played out across every Pacific battlefield. The final irony was that Japan's military doctrine, which demanded sacrifice and accepted massive casualties as inevitable, created the very conditions that made Japanese forces less effective in prolonged campaigns. Losing trained crews meant losing institutional knowledge, losing experience, losing the skills that made units effective. American doctrine, which prioritized preservation of trained personnel, created sustainable fighting forces that became more effective over time. Experienced crews survived, learned lessons, passed knowledge to new crew members. Unit effectiveness increased, even as equipment was replaced. The Sherman's escape hatches were not just safety features. They were force multipliers. They were investments in combat effectiveness. They were recognition that human capital was the most valuable resource in modern warfare. Japanese designers never fully understood this principle, even after examining captured Shermans, even after reading intelligence reports about American crew survival rates, even after interviewing survivors like Kubo, who could describe exactly what went wrong inside burning Japanese tanks. The cultural assumptions were too deeply embedded. The military doctrine was too inflexible. The philosophical foundations were too different. Yamamoto's report in May 1945 recommended changes that would have addressed these problems. Multiple escape hatches, better positioning, hull floor escapes, fire suppression, improved crew compartment layout, all the features that made Sherman crews survivable. The recommendations were filed, noted, and ignored. 3 months later, Japan surrendered. The war ended. The questions about tank design became academic. The men who died in inadequate vehicles would never benefit from lessons learned too late. Kubo survived the war, returned to Japan, lived a long life. He never spoke much about Saipan, never discussed the night his tank burned, never described climbing over his dead commander to reach the single usable hatch while flames consumed the interior. But sometimes, late at night, he would wake up, smelling smoke, feeling heat, hearing screams, remembering what it felt like to wait while fire spread, to wait while your only escape route was blocked, to wait and wonder if you would die because your designers had not given you enough ways out. American tank crews who survived the Pacific War had different memories of hitting the deck release on that floor escape hatch, dropping through, rolling clear under the tank's protective hull, watching their burning Sherman from a safe distance, knowing they were alive because someone had thought about their survival. 5 escape hatches versus 2, 5 chances versus 1, 5 ways out versus hope and luck. The difference between life and death, the difference between a military that valued its soldiers and one that saw them as expendable. The difference that Lieutenant Yamamoto documented in his August 1945 report. The difference that came too late to save men like Kubo's crew. The difference that represented everything wrong with Japanese military doctrine in World War II. When American occupation forces found Yamamoto's report after the surrender, they translated it and filed it with other captured Japanese documents. The report confirmed what American designers already knew. Crew survivability mattered. Escape hatches mattered. Giving soldiers a chance to survive mattered. The Sherman tank was not perfect. It had problems. American crews called it a Ronson early in the war because it would light on fire when hit. Engineers fixed that with wet ammunition storage. The 75mm gun was inadequate against German heavy tanks in Europe. Engineers fixed that with 76mm and 17-pounder variants. But from the beginning, from the first production models in February 1942, the Sherman gave its crew 5 ways out, 5 chances to survive, 5 opportunities to fight another day. Japanese tanks never had that. From the Type 97 Chiha in the 1930 I-8 to the Type 3 Chinu in 1945, Japanese designs consistently failed to prioritize crew survivability. The philosophy never changed, the doctrine never adapted, the lessons were never learned until it was too late to matter. That is the real story of the 5 escape hatches, not just a technical comparison of tank designs, but a comparison of values, of priorities, of which militaries saw their soldiers as assets worth preserving and which saw them as resources to be expended. The numbers do not lie. American tank crews survived at 3 times the rate of Japanese crews when their vehicles were knocked out. That survival rate translated into combat effectiveness, into experienced crews, into units that got better over time instead of being ground down by attrition. The 5 escape hatches were not just safety features. They were force multipliers. They were the physical manifestation of a military philosophy that valued human life and recognized that trained soldiers were irreplaceable. Japanese military philosophy never grasped that principle, and the cost of that failure was written in the burnt-out hulks of Type 97 tanks scattered across every Pacific battlefield, in the bodies of tank crews who died because they had nowhere to go when their vehicles burned, in the statistics that showed 90% casualties among Japanese tankers whose tanks were knocked out. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.